Hi guys, Austin here again. We're going to be going through the brain today. So we're going to go through the model for the brain, doing the mid-sagittal cross-section of the brain on the model, and then we're going to go through the brain dissection. So I'll actually dissect that for you guys, and then we're going to go through that. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so with the brain, it can feel like we're going through just a grab bag of terms that are pretty challenging, and the structures themselves are a little vague, but hopefully I can give you some tips to help you out as we're going through this. So the way that I like to do this is find the structures relative to other structures. And what I mean by that is learn a few structures first and then continue on and learn the other structures relative to the structures that you've already learned. So for instance, this large cerebral hemisphere, very easy to identify, as well as the cerebellum here. And so those are my first two starting points to start with, and identify the others based on those two. So this large white structure here that kind of loops around is the corpus callosum. So directly inferior to the corpus callosum is the septum pellucidum. That's kind of this open area right here. And then directly under that, or directly inferior to that, we have the fornix, which is this smaller white structure there. Inferior to the fornix, we have this circular area there, and that circular area is part of the thalamus. And the thalamus also has a little brown spot there, and that is the interthalamic adhesion. So we've been moving straight inferior this whole time. Now we're going to kind of go anterior. This would also be called a rostral on an animal. But we move a little anterior here, and we see this general region right there. So not this large lobe. So that's the thalamus. Over here, it is the hypothalamus. So it's technically a little bit underneath the thalamus, so therefore it gives the name hypothalamus. Connected to the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland, which plays a major role in regulating hormones of our body. But it's going to be connected to that thalamus, or the hypothalamus, by way of this stalk right there called the infundibulum. So the hypothalamus has the pituitary gland connected by the infundibulum. On our sheep brain, we're actually going to see only the infundibulum stalk. We won't see the pituitary gland because when they remove the brains, usually that pituitary gland does not stick around. So we'll see the infundibulum on the sheep brain. So moving a little superior to that, we see another structure that is similar in shape, looks similar to pituitary gland. It is the optic chiasma. And so this optic chiasma here, really when we look at it in 3 dimensions at the base of the brain on the sheep brain, it's not going to look too similar to this. Okay, so it's really a crossing point of the optic nerves. And so we'll see that on our sheep brain. So now if we look just posterior to the pituitary gland, we'll see a little nodule right there. And that nodule right there is the mammillary body. Okay, and we'll see this on the base of our sheep brain as well. Now let's move inferior, so we'll go down into the spinal tract. And so directly inferior to our thalamus there, we have 2 lobes. And so there's one huge lobe there and a little bit smaller lobe right there. The bigger lobe here is the pons. So this entire area is the pons, while directly underneath that is the medulla oblongata. Okay? And then directly underneath the medulla oblongata, you have the spinal cord. Okay, the spinal cord will continue down. So let's go back to the cerebellum. There's one little structure in here called the arbor vitae. That's kind of the center of all of these branch points. So directly kind of posterior to our pons area, we have a few structures in this area that we need to know about. So this number 14, that little bitty pink structure right there, is the pineal gland, right? So the pineal gland, we're going to be able to open up our sheep brain before we make the cross section, and we're going to be able to open up the cerebral hemisphere and the cerebellum, and we're going to be able to see that pineal gland in the sheep brain. So we'll do that later. Directly underneath the pineal gland, we're going to have this structure right here, which is the corpora quadrigemina. And so it's called the corpora quadrigemina because it will have 4 lobes on it. So we can't really see the lobes here in this cross section, but since it's got 4 lobes, we call it the corpora quadrigemina. Go through those really quick again. You have the cerebral hemisphere. You have the corpus callosum, septum pellucidum, fornix, thalamus, interthalamic adhesion, hypothalamus, pituitary gland connected to the infundibulum, the optic chiasma, mammillary body, the pons, medulla oblongata, spinal cord, cerebellum, arbor vitae, pineal gland, and the corpora quadrigemina. All right, so we have a sheep brain here. First thing, I need to get rid of the dura mater that's surrounding the outsides of this midbrain. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. All right, so now we got the dura mater off. We need to now identify some structures at the base of the brain. So these little 2 nodes up here, all the way on the anterior, I guess it'd be ventral surface, so it'll be ventral over here and caudal this way. Up here at the ventral surface, we have these olfactory bulbs here. And so these olfactory bulbs is where we're going to have our tracts that take sensory from our nose and deliver it to the olfactory processing center. So the olfactory bulbs are there. And then if we move caudal, we can see these 2 nerves there, which are going to converge at this point. So these are the 2 optic nerves. They'll be coming from the back of the eye. So we'll see the optic nerve on the eye. And then they converge at the optic chiasma. So this is what I said on the model. Kind of looks like it's the pituitary gland, but in 3 dimensions, it is an X. It is a crossing point for the optic nerves because the left side of the brain is going to process the sensory from the right side of the brain. So everything coming from the left eye over here crosses over and goes to the left side of the brain to be processed. So we got the optic nerves, the optic chiasma there. And then moving caudal still, we have this little hole area, and that hole right there is where the infundibulum would be. Okay, so we're going to be identifying that as the infundibulum right there. And that's where I said was the stalk for the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland would be here, but when we do the dissection, the pituitary gland and usually the actual stalk gets ripped out. Directly caudal to that, we have this lobe right here I'm kind of pushing on, and that lobe is the mammillary body. And so remember, just posterior to the pituitary gland, we saw the mammillary body on the model. Same thing here, we have the mammillary body right there. So a little lateral from that, so a little caudal and a little lateral. On both sides, we have the cerebral peduncle, and that's kind of like the base of the brain here. So the cerebral peduncle is there. So they look like little columns. That's really what peduncle means, like columns. And then if we continue to move caudal, we see the first lobe right here. And that first large lobe is the pons. And then the second lobe down here is the medulla oblongata. Okay? So going through that, olfactory bulbs, optic nerves, optic chiasma, infundibulum, mammillary body, cerebral peduncles, pons, medulla oblongata, and then spinal cord. So we also need to look at the pineal gland, and we can see the pineal gland if we open up. So we're taking the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and I'm pulling it apart just like this. When I open that up, See that little ball on there, which is the pineal gland. Okay, directly inferior to the pineal gland, we can see the corpora quadrigemina, and we can see the 4 lobes. Okay, we'll come back. Now we need to cut this in a cross section. And so now we can see a few of our structures that are on the internal surfaces. So just like on our brain model, we have the cerebral hemisphere here. The top white structure, the top circular structure up top, is the corpus callosum. This opening here is the septum pellucidum. This structure right underneath the septum pellucidum is the fornix. The circular area right there is the thalamus. So moving in front there, we can see the optic chiasma, which attaches to that optic nerve there. So the optic chiasma is right there where the optic nerves cross. The infundibulum would be right there in this whole area, which we can't see too well. So that puts the hypothalamus in this region. So we got the thalamus and then the hypothalamus. Moving back this way, we see the pineal gland here. So that's the pineal gland. Moving caudal still, the corpora quadrigemina. We have the pons, which is the first large lobe going down the spinal tract. And then the medulla oblongata is the second lobe. So we've got a little lobe there and a lobe there, medulla oblongata, and then we have the spinal cord. Looking in the cerebellum, we can see the arbor vitae there, and this entire structure is the cerebellum.